The chrome exhaust pipes of the Harley-Davidson roared like thunder as Marcus "Tank" Sullivan pulled into the gravel parking lot of Rosie's Diner. The sound shattered the peaceful afternoon silence of Cedar Creek, Texas, a small town where nothing ever happened, until today. Tank cut the engine and the sudden quiet felt ominous. He was a mountain of a man, 6'4" with arms covered in tattoos that told stories of violence and rebellion. His leather vest bore the colors of the Iron Wolves, a motorcycle club that had been terrorizing small towns across the Southwest for months. Today, Cedar Creek was just another stop on their path of intimidation. Inside the diner, 22-year-old Keisha Williams felt her heart skip as she heard the motorcycle's aggressive rumble die away. She'd been working double shifts at Rosie's for 3 months, saving every penny to pay for her mother's medical bills and her own community college tuition. The nursing program wouldn't wait, and neither would the bill collectors. Through the large front window, Keisha watched Tank dismount his bike with deliberate menace. His boots hit the gravel like hammer strikes, and she noticed how other customers in the parking lot quickly averted their eyes and hurried to their cars. Something about this man radiated danger. What Keisha couldn't see from her position behind the counter was the black SUV parked across the street. Inside sat a man whose face was known to millions. John Cena, WWE superstar and Hollywood actor. He'd been driving through Texas after visiting a children's hospital in Dallas when his publicist called with urgent news about a charity event in Houston. Now he sat reviewing his notes, occasionally glancing up at the quaint diner that reminded him of his hometown in Massachusetts. Tank pushed through the glass door with enough force to make the bell above it ring frantically. The sound was like an alarm, and every conversation in the diner died instantly. 6 customers sat frozen at their tables, an elderly couple sharing coffee, a trucker reading his newspaper, a young mother with her toddler, and 2 construction workers on their lunch break. Well, Tank's voice boomed across the small space. What do we have here? Keisha straightened her shoulders and approached the counter with as much confidence as she could muster. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. Welcome to Rosie's Diner. Can I get you something to eat? Tank's eyes swept over her with undisguised contempt. He noticed her name tag, the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite her obvious nervousness, and something in his expression shifted to something darker. Yeah, you can get me something, he said, his voice dripping with malice. You can get me some respect. Around here, people like you should know their place. The words hit the diner like a physical blow. The elderly woman gasped softly. The construction workers shifted uncomfortably in their booth. The young mother pulled her child closer. Keisha felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice professional. Sir, I'm just here to serve you food. What would you like from our menu? Tank laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Menu? Girl, I don't think you understand who you're talking to. I'm Tank Sullivan, Iron Wolves MC. When I ride into a town, people show me respect, especially people like you. Across the street, John Cena looked up from his paperwork at the sound of the motorcycle engine earlier. Something about the aggressive way the biker had entered the diner caught his attention. Years of community work and advocacy had made him sensitive to situations where people might need help. He set his papers aside and focused on the scene unfolding through the diner's large windows. Inside, Tank was just getting started. He leaned across the counter, invading Keisha's personal space. You know what your problem is? You people think you can just serve food and expect decent folks to eat it? Maybe you should find work more suited to your kind. The racial undertones in his words were unmistakable. Keisha stepped back, her professional composure wavering for the first time. She'd faced discrimination before, but never with such naked hostility, never while trapped behind a counter with nowhere to run. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice and treat our customers with respect, she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Tank's face twisted into an ugly sneer. Customers? Honey, I'm the customer here. And the customer is always right. So when I tell you that people like you don't belong serving food to decent Americans, you'd better listen. The tension in the diner was suffocating. Every person there knew they were witnessing something terrible, but fear kept them frozen in their seats. This wasn't just about one man's hatred, it was about the silence that allowed such hatred to flourish. Outside, John Cena's jaw tightened as he watched the biker's aggressive body language through the window. He couldn't hear the words, but the scene spoke volumes. Something was very wrong, and every instinct told him that intervention might soon become necessary. Tank's voice grew louder, more aggressive as he fed off the fear in the room. You know what really gets me? He continued, his fist pounding the counter. Places like this hiring your kind when there are real Americans who need jobs. But I guess that's what happens when bleeding hearts start running businesses. Keisha's composure finally cracked. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She thought of her mother lying in the hospital bed, of the stack of bills on her kitchen table, of the dreams that depended on this job. "Sir, I'm just trying to work. I haven't done anything to you." "Haven't done anything?" Tank roared. "Your existence is doing something to me. Every time I see one of you people acting like you belong in decent society, it makes me sick." The elderly man at table 3 slowly stood up, his weathered hands shaking. "Son, that's enough. This young lady hasn't." Tank whirled around, his massive frame casting a shadow over the frail 70-year-old. "Did I ask for your opinion, Grandpa? Sit down before you fall down." The old man's wife tugged at his sleeve desperately. "Harold, please just sit down." Harold's eyes met Keisha's across the room. In them she saw compassion, regret, and the weight of a generation that had witnessed too much injustice in silence. Slowly, sadly, he sank back into his chair. Tank turned back to Keisha with renewed venom. "See that? Even the old-timers know better than to interfere. They understand the natural order of things." From his position across the street, John Cena watched the scene escalate through the diner's windows. He could see the biker's aggressive posture, the way other customers seemed to shrink away, and most importantly, the young waitress who stood alone behind the counter. Her body language spoke of someone trying to maintain dignity in the face of humiliation. John's phone buzzed, his publicist again, but he ignored it. His mind raced through the values that had guided his entire career: respect, perseverance, and never giving up. More importantly, he thought about his work with anti-bullying campaigns, his advocacy for equality, and the promise he'd made to himself long ago to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Inside the diner, Tank was reaching into his leather jacket. Keisha's eyes widened in terror as she imagined what he might be pulling out. Instead, he produced a crumpled $20 bill and threw it at her feet. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice dangerously quiet now. "You're going to get down on your hands and knees and pick up that money. Then you're going to thank me for the privilege of serving a real American. And if you do a good job, maybe I'll leave a tip." The diner was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Keisha stared at the crumpled bill on the floor, her entire body trembling. Every customer in the restaurant held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "I'm not going to do that," Keisha said quietly. Tank's face went purple with rage. "What did you just say to me?" "I said I'm not going to do that." Her voice was stronger now, fed by a lifetime of her grandmother's lessons about dignity and self-respect. "I'm a human being. I work hard, I pay my taxes, and I treat people with respect. I won't be humiliated because of your hatred." The silence that followed was deafening. Tank's hands clenched into fists the size of ham hocks. The construction workers exchanged glances, as if debating whether to intervene. The young mother gathered her child and moved toward the back of the restaurant. Tank stepped around the counter, violating the last barrier between himself and Keisha. "You think you're brave? You think standing up to me makes you some kind of hero? I'm going to teach you a lesson about respect that you'll never forget." Outside, John Cena had seen enough. He turned off his SUV's engine and stepped onto the asphalt. At 6'1" and 250 pounds of solid muscle, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced down countless adversaries. But this wasn't about physical intimidation, this was about doing what was right. As John crossed the street, Tank grabbed Keisha's wrist. "You're going to pick up that money and you're going to apologize for disrespecting me, or things are going to get very unpleasant for you." "Let go of me," Keisha said, trying to pull away. Tank's grip tightened and she winced in pain. That's when the diner door opened with a soft chime that somehow managed to cut through the tension like a sword through silk. Every head in the restaurant turned toward the entrance. John Cena stood in the doorway, his presence immediately shifting the entire dynamic of the room. He was dressed casually, jeans, a simple t-shirt, and sneakers. But there was something about him that commanded instant attention. Maybe it was his perfectly calm demeanor in contrast to the chaos, or maybe it was the way he looked directly at Tank without a trace of fear. "Excuse me," John said politely, his voice carrying just enough authority to make Tank pause. "Is there a problem here?" Tank released Keisha's wrist and turned to face this unexpected interruption. He was used to his size and reputation clearing rooms, not drawing new players into the game. "Yeah, there's a problem," Tank snarled. "This is a private conversation between me and the help. Why don't you mind your own business?" John stepped fully into the diner, letting the door close behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded final. John Cena's entrance had an immediate effect on everyone in the diner. The elderly couple recognized him first. Harold's eyes widened and he whispered to his wife, "Margaret, that's John Cena." The construction workers looked up from their coffee, suddenly aware they were witnessing something that would make one hell of a story. Even the young mother stopped her retreat toward the back exit, instinctively sensing that the cavalry had just arrived. But Tank Sullivan didn't watch wrestling, didn't follow Hollywood, and had no idea who this newcomer was. All he saw was another obstacle to his demonstration of power. "I said mind your own business," Tank repeated, taking a step toward John. "Unless you want to become part of the problem." John remained perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides. Years of professional wrestling had taught him to read opponents, to sense when violence was inevitable and when it might still be avoided. Tank was a powder keg, but John had defused bigger bombs than this. "Actually, this is my business," John said calmly. "See, I make it my business when I see someone being treated with disrespect." Behind the counter, Keisha rubbed her wrist where Tank had grabbed her. She didn't recognize the stranger either, but something about his presence made her stand a little straighter. Here was someone who wasn't afraid, someone who had chosen to step into the storm when everyone else was running for cover. Tank laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "Oh, we got ourselves a hero here. Let me guess, you're one of those liberal do-gooders who thinks everyone deserves a participation trophy?" "I'm someone who believes everyone deserves basic human dignity," John replied. "And right now it looks like this young lady could use some support." The words hit Tank like a physical blow. In his world, strength was everything, and this stranger was showing strength without aggression, confidence without arrogance. It was a combination that Tank's simple worldview couldn't process. "You don't know what you're dealing with, pretty boy," Tank said, his voice rising. "I'm Marcus Sullivan, Iron Wolves MC. I've broken men twice your size for half the disrespect you're showing me right now." John nodded thoughtfully. "Iron Wolves? I've heard of you. Weren't you the club that got run out of Arizona last month? Something about intimidating local businesses?" Tank's face went pale. The Arizona incident was supposed to be kept quiet. Local authorities had made it clear that the Iron Wolves weren't welcome, and the club had been forced to relocate their operations to Texas. How did this stranger know about it? Who the hell are you?" Tank demanded. John smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm someone who pays attention. And what I've been paying attention to is a pattern of behavior that ends today." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Tank was used to being the most dangerous person in any room he entered, but something about this stranger's quiet confidence was unsettling. Still, he'd come too far to back down now. "Pattern of behavior?" Tank spat. "The only pattern I see is weak people needing to learn their place. And if you don't get out of here right now, you're going to learn yours too." John glanced at Keisha, who was watching the confrontation with a mixture of fear and hope. Then he looked around the diner at the other customers, ordinary people caught in an extraordinary moment, waiting to see if good would triumph over evil or if they'd have to live with the memory of watching evil win. "Let me ask you something, Tank," John said, using the biker's nickname with deliberate familiarity. "What exactly do you think you're accomplishing here? Scaring a young woman who's just trying to do her job? Terrorizing a family diner? Making children afraid?" "I'm teaching respect," Tank snarled. "Something your generation never learned." John shook his head slowly. "No, you're teaching fear. And there's a big difference between the two." The philosophical nature of the conversation was frustrating Tank, who was more comfortable with straightforward intimidation. "Enough talking," he said, reaching into his leather vest. "Time for action." Every person in the diner tensed, expecting him to pull out a weapon. Instead, Tank produced his cell phone and speed-dialed a number. "Yeah, it's Tank," he said when someone answered. "I need backup at some diner in Cedar Creek. Got a situation that needs handling." He paused, listening. "No, just one guy, but he's being a real pain." "Yeah, bring the boys." John listened to this exchange with growing concern, not for himself, but for the innocent people in the diner. What had started as one man's hatred was about to become something much more dangerous. "How many boys?" John asked when Tank ended the call. Tank grinned, the expression ugly on his scarred face. "Enough." The Iron Wolves rolled deep, hero. "Hope you said your prayers this morning." Keisha felt her heart sink. The stranger had tried to help, but now he was in danger too, and it was all because she'd refused to be humiliated. "Sir," she said to John, "you should leave. This isn't your fight." John turned to her, and for the first time since entering the diner, his expression softened. "Miss, what's your name?" "Keisha." "Keisha Williams." "Well, Keisha Williams, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not going anywhere. See, I learned a long time ago that the only way evil wins is when good people do nothing. And I'm not about to do nothing. Tank was growing impatient with the conversation. 20 minutes, he announced to the room. My boys will be here in 20 minutes and then we're going to settle this properly. So I suggest everyone clear out except for Hero Boy here and the help. This is about to get messy. The elderly couple started to rise from their table, but John held up a hand. Actually, I'd like everyone to stay right where they are. This conversation isn't over, and I think it's important that everyone hears how it ends. Harold sat back down, his wife clutching his arm. The construction workers remained in their booth, their lunch forgotten. The young mother with her child stayed put, something in John's demeanor convincing her that he knew what he was doing. Tank stared at John in disbelief. Are you insane? Do you have any idea what's about to happen to you? John checked his watch, a simple Timex that had been a gift from his father. 20 minutes, you said? Give or take. John nodded and walked over to the counter where Keisha stood. Keisha, do you mind if I use your phone? I need to make a call. Of course, she said, sliding the cordless phone across the counter. John dialed a number from memory and waited. Tank watched with growing unease as the stranger's call was apparently answered immediately. Hey, it's John, he said into the phone. Yeah, I'm good. Listen, I need a favor. He gave the address of the diner and explained the situation in calm, measured terms. Tank couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but he saw John nod several times and say, perfect. 20 minutes. When John hung up, he was smiling. The next 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. Tank paced near the front window, occasionally checking his phone and muttering to himself. John had taken a seat at the counter, calmly sipping the coffee that Keisha had poured him, as if this were just another ordinary afternoon. You're making a big mistake, Tank said for the fourth time. When my boys get here, there won't be anything left of you to identify. John stirred his coffee thoughtfully. Tank, can I ask you something personal? The question caught the biker off guard. What? What made you this way? I mean, you weren't born hating people. Something happened to make you like this. Tank's face twisted with confusion and rage. What kind of psychological garbage is that? I don't hate anyone. I just believe in keeping people in their proper place. And where's Keisha's proper place? John asked quietly. Not serving food to decent Americans, Tank replied automatically. John nodded as if this made perfect sense. And who decides who counts as decent Americans? People like me, Tank said. People who built this country. Built it how? By treating others with respect? By giving everyone a fair chance? By judging people by their character instead of their appearance? Tank was getting frustrated by the philosophical nature of the conversation. He was a man of action, not words, and this stranger's calm questioning was more unsettling than any threat would have been. Behind the counter, Keisha watched the exchange with fascination. The stranger, John, he'd said his name wasn't trying to outmuscle Tank or outshout him. Instead, he was doing something far more powerful. He was making Tank think. Look, Tank said, his voice slightly less certain than before, I don't have time for this liberal college professor nonsense. In 20 minutes. 15 minutes now, John corrected, checking his watch. In 15 minutes you're going to find out what real power looks like. John took another sip of his coffee. Tank, I'm curious about this real power you keep talking about. Is real power the ability to make a young woman afraid? To clear a room with threats? To call for backup when you can't handle a conversation? Real power is making people respect you, Tank said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Respect or fear? John asked. Because there's a difference. Respect is earned through your actions, your character, how you treat others. Fear is just, well, it's what bullies use when they don't have anything else. Around the diner, the other customers were listening intently to this surreal conversation. Harold, the elderly man, found himself nodding along with John's words. The construction workers had abandoned any pretense of eating and were hanging on every exchange. Even the young mother had relaxed slightly, sensing that somehow this wasn't going to end the way Tank intended. Tank's phone buzzed. He answered it eagerly. Yeah. What do you mean delayed? Traffic? What traffic? His face grew red as he listened. Fine. How long? Another 20 minutes? This is ridiculous. John smiled as Tank ended the call. Backup running late? Shut up, Tank snapped. They'll be here. I'm sure they will, John agreed. But while we're waiting, maybe we could continue our conversation about respect. Tank slammed his fist on the nearest table, making the salt and pepper shakers jump. I don't want to talk anymore. I want to settle this man to man right here, right now. John stood up slowly, his movement fluid and controlled. At his full height, he was nearly as tall as Tank and just as broad. But where Tank's bulk came from beer and aggression, John's came from years of disciplined training. Are you sure about that? John asked quietly. For the first time since entering the diner, Tank felt a flicker of uncertainty. There was something about the way this stranger moved, the way he carried himself, that suggested he might be more than he appeared. Who are you really? Tank demanded. I mean, who are you really? John smiled and extended his hand. John Cena. Pleased to meet you. The name hit the room like lightning. Harold gasped and grabbed his wife's hand. Margaret, I told you. I told you it was him. The construction worker's jaws dropped. The young mother pulled out her phone and started recording. But it was Keisha's reaction that mattered most. Her eyes went wide as she realized that a genuine celebrity, someone with real influence and platform, had chosen to stand up for her. Not because cameras were rolling or because it would be good publicity, but because it was the right thing to do. Tank, however, still looked confused. John who? Cena, one of the construction workers called out. Dude, he's like a massive WWE superstar. And he's in movies and stuff. Tank's confusion deepened into suspicion. You're lying. John pulled out his phone and showed Tank his screen, hundreds of social media notifications, missed calls from his publicist, text messages from other celebrities. The phone's lock screen showed a photo of John in his wrestling gear, championship belt over his shoulder. Still think I'm lying? John asked. Tank studied the phone, his brain trying to process this new information. A celebrity. A real, actual celebrity was standing in this nobody diner in this nobody town, confronting him over his treatment of a waitress. Why? Tank asked, his voice smaller now. Why do you care what happens to her? John looked at Keisha, then at the other customers, then back at Tank. Because everyone matters. Every single person in this room has value, has dignity, deserves to be treated with respect. That's not a political statement or a liberal agenda. That's just basic human decency. Tank's phone rang again. This time, his conversation was brief and his face grew pale as he listened. When he hung up, his shoulders had sagged. Let me guess, John said. The cavalry isn't coming. Tank nodded slowly. Cops set up a roadblock. Said they got reports of motorcycle gang activity in the area. My boys are stuck on Highway 35. John's smile was knowing. Funny how these things work out. Around the diner, the tension was finally beginning to break. The customers sensed that the immediate danger had passed, that somehow this situation was going to end without violence. But John wasn't finished yet. This wasn't just about defusing one confrontation, it was about changing a mind, about reaching past the hatred to find whatever humanity might still exist in Tank Sullivan. Tank, John said, his voice gentle now, you still haven't answered my question. What made you this way? Tank Sullivan stood in the middle of Rosie's diner, surrounded by ordinary people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. For the first time in years, he was forced to confront the question that John Cena had asked. What had made him this way? The silence stretched until Tank finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. My daddy. John waited, sensing that something important was about to be revealed. My daddy was a hard man, Tank continued, his eyes focused on something far beyond the diner's walls. Worked construction his whole life, came home angry every night. He taught me that the world was divided into two kinds of people. Those who took what they wanted and those who got stepped on. Keisha found herself leaning forward, drawn into this unexpected moment of vulnerability from the man who had terrorized her just minutes before. He used to say that respect was something you took, not something you earned, Tank went on. Said that showing weakness would get you killed in this world. So I learned to be hard. Learned to be mean. Learned to make people afraid because afraid people don't fight back. John nodded slowly. And how's that working out for you? Tank looked around the diner, at Harold and Margaret holding hands across their table, at the construction workers who had been ready to help if needed, at the young mother who was protecting her child, at Keisha who had stood up to him despite her fear. Not so good, I guess, he admitted. Tank, John said, can I tell you about my daddy? The biker nodded, curious despite himself. My father taught me that real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. He said that anyone can be a bully, but it takes courage to be kind. He taught me that the measure of a man isn't how many people fear him, but how many people he helps. Tank's hands, which had been clenched into fists for the past hour, slowly relaxed at his sides. John continued, your daddy was wrong about a lot of things. But maybe he was right about one thing: the world is divided into two kinds of people. There are people who use their strength to help others, and people who use it to hurt others. The question is, which one do you want to be? The diner was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind the register. Everyone waited to see what Tank would choose. Tank looked at Keisha, really looked at her for the first time since entering the diner. He saw not a target for his hatred, but a young woman working hard to build a better life. He saw the dignity she'd maintained even when he tried to strip it away. He saw the courage it had taken to stand up to him. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. The words seemed to surprise him as much as anyone else in the room. "I'm sorry," he repeated louder this time. "Miss Williams, I'm truly sorry. What I said to you, how I treated you, there's no excuse for it. I was wrong." Keisha studied his face, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. What she saw instead was genuine remorse, the look of a man confronting his own shame for the first time in years. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because you didn't deserve it," Tank replied. "Nobody deserves to be treated like that. I was taught wrong and I've been living wrong and I'm tired of being angry all the time." John stepped forward and placed a hand on Tank's shoulder. "That's the first step, man. Admitting you were wrong, that takes real courage." Tank looked down at the $20 bill still lying on the floor where he'd thrown it. He bent down, picked it up and smoothed it out carefully. "Miss Williams," he said, approaching the counter with none of his earlier aggression. "This is for you. Not because I'm making you take it, but because you earned it by standing up to me. By showing me what real dignity looks like." Keisha accepted the money, but more importantly, she accepted the apology behind it. Harold, who had remained silent through most of the confrontation, finally stood up again. This time Tank didn't try to intimidate him. "Son," Harold said, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades, "I've seen a lot of hatred in my time. I've seen what it does to people, how it eats them from the inside out. What happened here today, that took guts. Changing your mind, admitting you were wrong, that's the hardest thing a person can do." Margaret nodded agreement. "We're proud of you, dear. Both of you," she added, including John in her praise. One of the construction workers stood up and extended his hand to Tank. "Name's Mike Rodriguez. I want to shake your hand, man. Takes a big person to admit when they're wrong." Tank shook Mike's hand, then found himself shaking hands with everyone in the diner. Harold, Margaret, the other construction worker, even the young mother, who introduced herself as Jennifer and her daughter as Emma. "What happens now?" Tank asked John. "Now you go live differently," John replied. "You use this experience to become the man your father never taught you to be. You spread respect instead of fear. You help people instead of hurting them." Tank nodded slowly. "What about the Iron Wolves? What about them?" "I can't go back. Not after this. They won't understand." John smiled. "Then maybe it's time to find a new pack. There are plenty of organizations that could use someone with your strength and your newfound wisdom. Ever think about mentoring kids? Teaching them that there's a better way than the one you learned?" The idea seemed to intrigue Tank. "You think kids would listen to someone like me? Kids who are heading down the same path you went down? Yeah, I think they'd listen. Especially if you can show them there's another way." Keisha, who had been quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up. "Mr. Sullivan?" "Just Tank, miss. Mr. Sullivan was my daddy." "Tank then. I want you to know that I forgive you. And I hope you find what you're looking for." Tank's eyes filled with tears, the first tears he'd shed since he was a child. "Thank you, Miss Williams. That means more than you know." As Tank prepared to leave, John called after him. "Tank? One more thing." "Yeah. Next time you're in a situation where you can stand up for someone else, I hope you'll remember what happened here today." Tank nodded. "I will. And Mr. Cena? Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like." After Tank left, the diner slowly returned to normal. Harold and Margaret finished their coffee and left a generous tip. The construction workers paid their bill and headed back to work, already planning how they'd tell this story to their families. Jennifer and Emma ordered ice cream sundaes to celebrate the fact that sometimes heroes really do show up when you need them most. John was preparing to leave when Keisha approached him. "Mr. Cena," she said, "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," John replied. "You stood up for yourself when it mattered. That's all the thanks I need. But why did you get involved? You could have just driven by." John considered the question seriously. "Because that's not who I am. My whole career has been built on the idea that you never give up, that you always do the right thing, that you stand up for people who need standing up for. How could I drive by and ignore that?" Keisha smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed all day. Well, for what it's worth, you've got a customer for life. Anytime you're in Cedar Creek, your meal is on the house. John laughed. I'll take you up on that. But right now I've got to get to Houston. There's a charity event I'm already late for. As John reached the door, he turned back one more time. Keisha. Yes. Keep standing up for yourself. Keep believing in your dreams. The world needs more people like you. And with that, John Cena walked out of Rosie's diner and back to his SUV, leaving behind a young woman who stood a little taller, a small town that had witnessed something miraculous, and a biker who rode away on his Harley with a completely different understanding of what it meant to be strong. 6 months later, Tank Sullivan would begin working with at-risk youth in Dallas, teaching them about respect, dignity, and the difference between strength and bullying. Keisha Williams would graduate from nursing school with honors and eventually open her own clinic in Cedar Creek. And John Cena would continue being John Cena, proof that sometimes heroes really do exist and sometimes they're exactly where you need them to be, exactly when you need them to be there. The reckoning at Rosie's diner had ended not with violence, but with redemption. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful victory of all.